I knew the exact moment the mask slipped. It wasn't dramatic, not at first. No slammed doors, no shouting. Just the snap of his fingers, that tiny flick of power he'd picked up from some leadership podcast. And the way everyone on the patio looked at me to see if I'd jump. I didn't. I smiled that dangerous, polite smile women learn early, and I kept talking to the neighbor about her hydrangeas, as if my husband hadn't just tried to summon me like a server. His friends glanced down at their beers. His sister watched me with the careful look of someone who's learned to measure the storm by the scent of ozone. He did it again, softer this time, like a reminder. The air shifted, summer thick and electric. The last time he'd snapped his fingers at me, we were alone, and I handed him the salt anyway. I didn't that night. I was done handing things over. People ask how you get there, how you go from laughing into someone's shoulder to calculating the distance between you and the door without letting it look like you're counting. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in inches. It happens in compliments that nudge and jokes that bruise. It happens when love starts to sound like a contract read too fast. We met in Austin after a storm that painted the sky that weird blue-green you can't describe if you haven't stood under it. I'd just come off a long day teaching art to kids who thought a paintbrush was a sword and glue belonged in hair. I had paint on my forearm I'd missed in the mirror and a scar on my thumb from a utility knife, still pink and proud like a tiny flag. He was at the counter, wet curls pushed back, talking to the barista about beans like he was choosing a tiny country to annex. "Carter Hale," he said when he turned to me, as if he was used to announcing himself. "You've got the most expressive hands," I laughed. Because it felt like a compliment, and also because it wasn't about my face or my body, and I was tired of men who cataloged features like they were shopping. He told me he'd built things, that he'd started a company out of his messy apartment and a shared office that smelled like hope and instant noodles. He said he wanted to make something that would last. I told him I wanted the same. He made it easy to lean on him. He knew where the good tacos were and the hidden mural behind the bookstore. He played vinyl like a ritual, a little smoke and crackle that made even ordinary days feel cinematic. He listened. He held my coffee with two hands and looked at me while I talked about the tiny revolutions that happen in classrooms. The shy kid who stealth sang during cleanup. The boy who misunderstood perspective and accidentally made a sky that felt bigger than the page. When he asked me to move in, it sounded like a team decision. When he asked me to marry him, it sounded like a business pitch he'd polished for weeks. He had a ring and a picnic and a speech about partnership and empire and building a life where we took care of each other. I said yes and meant it. The morning after we got engaged, he came back from a run, cheeks pink, and said, "My lawyer wants us to be smart, just a formality." I was rinsing raspberries in the sink, red bleeding into the water, and he said the word prenup without flinching. He smiled like it was a gift to me, like this meant I was marrying a man who had a plan. "You know, I don't care about your money," I told him. "Exactly," he said. "It's not emotional. It's logistics." We sat at his dining table the way people sit at a conference. Papers spread out, highlighted phrases, the faint smell of printer ink and lemon cleaner. He kissed my knuckles before we flipped through the pages. "We'll just get this out of the way," he said, "and get back to the good stuff." There were clauses about property I didn't own and equity in things I couldn't touch. It felt like watching someone pack a suitcase for a trip you weren't going on. My stomach went low anyway. I called my Aunt Tess, who'd become my emergency contact long before the term was official. She told me to get my own lawyer, a woman she knew who kept a white orchid on her desk and never once touched it. "Respect your instincts," my lawyer said, sliding a small glass of water across her desk like a peace offering. "But also respect precedent. Everything sounds hypothetical until it isn't." We added things that seemed, at the time, almost poetic. We wrote down the life we wanted in soft language next to the hard stuff. There were ordinary protections about what was his and what would be ours. But there was also a paragraph about dignity, about autonomy, about no surveillance in shared spaces, about choices around work, around care, about the effort we'd both make to attend to each other's personhood. And there was a part, buried but clear, about what would happen if he chose control over partnership. It mentioned therapy, it mentioned respect, and it drew a line I hoped we'd never need. He signed with a flourish, a little joke about straight lines and shaky hands. He kissed my palm. We put the papers in a fireproof box behind the winter sweaters we never wore in Texas. The months that followed were hot and full and easy in the ways good beginnings often are. We got married under an oak tree with lights like stars trapped in branches. He cried in a way his friends teased him about for weeks. We rented a house with a yard just big enough for a dog we kept promising to adopt. We made pancakes on Sundays and burned the first few every single time because we got distracted talking. We were ordinary. We were happy. Then life got complicated like life always does, and the seams we'd ironed started to pucker. The company he'd talked about the day we met sprouted limbs and teeth. He began to measure days in meetings, in flights, in boardrooms that smelled like money and fear. I started to measure days in naps and diapers and the exact shade of peach our daughter's cheeks turned when she laughed so hard she hiccuped. Ellie arrived like thunder rolling in, all at once and then everywhere. Our house shifted on its foundation to make room for her. I taught less and then not at all, promising myself I'd go back. Carter was homeless, promising himself it was temporary. It's easy to forgive the first missed dinner, the forgotten anniversary, the late-night call you have to take, even though the baby's teeth are trying to rote themselves through her gums. It's easy to forgive the second. After a while, forgiveness starts to taste like something you've reheated too many times, and you realize you've been eating it alone. The small things came first. He wanted our kitchen counters bare because clutter meant we didn't have our lives together. He wanted an app to control the lights because efficiency was love. He wanted me to forward him childcare receipts so he could keep a finger on the pulse. He wanted me to wear certain dresses to certain events because they photographed better. He wanted me to be softer, more polished, less tired. He wanted our home to feel like a showroom he lived in between flights. He became a man with feedback. Maybe don't post pictures of Ellie's face, he said, as if I'd been reckless instead of careful. Maybe tone down the captions. They feel a little needy. He said the word as if it stuck in his teeth. He stopped introducing me as an art teacher who used to make magic happen with pipe cleaners and marker caps. He started introducing me as the one who keeps our operation running, which sounded like a compliment if you didn't examine it too closely. When his investors came for dinner, he snapped once at the skillet smoking and once at me. I was the one who apologized. I began to keep a little list, not because I wanted to build a case, but because I didn't trust my own memory anymore. When you're told constantly that the issue is your tone, your timing, your too muchness, you want receipts. So I wrote it down when he critiqued my laugh, when he told me to check with him before making plans with my sister, when he moved the baby monitor to his side of the bed and slept through every cry anyway, when he told me our home should be quiet after a certain hour because he needed to protect his brain. When I think back now to the moment the switch flipped, I picture myself alone in my car in the grocery store parking lot, holding a carton of eggs so carefully you'd think they were rare birds. Ellie had fallen asleep in her car seat with a Cheerio stuck to her cheek. There was a message from Carter on my phone, long, concerned, reasonable. He wanted us to align. He wanted to set expectations for success. He wanted to write down some household rules to keep us from having miscommunications. He concluded that we were a business too, and that businesses thrived with order. He used words like respect and commitment and partnership. He didn't use the words control or compliant or concession, but they were there, floating like shadows behind the ones he chose. I drove home the long way, because the road that goes by the lake lets you remember how it feels to be something other than a role. I listened to Ellie breathe. And then I went inside, set the eggs gently on the counter, and watched as my husband slid a stapled packet across the island as if it were a birthday card. I put a lot of thought into this, he said, breathless in the way of someone who believes they've solved a problem. I know you'll see the love behind it. Even now, I don't remember every line. I remember the tone. The rules began with kindness, a paragraph about gratitude, about speaking softly even when we're tired, about each of us doing our part. Then, the words narrowed. There were rules about my clothes and where I wore them, rules about when I could make plans and with whom, rules about family visits and what was healthy for Ellie, rules about posting and privacy that managed to make me feel like a threat to my own child. There was a rule about my tone, a rule about my laugh. There was a section about finances that made me feel like a teenager asking for gas money. At the bottom, he'd left a blank space for my signature, as if my consent were a formality, as if I were just catching up. He watched me with that shiny hope he saved for pitches. He wanted me to clap. He wanted me to tell him he'd made us better. I picked up the packet and felt the weight of it. Ellie babbled from her playmat on the floor, delighting in her own toes, oblivious to the earthquake happening at our kitchen island. I thought about all the times I'd crashed on the couch with a baby on my chest and my shirt stained. texting him pictures he'd double tap and then forget to respond to. I thought about every dentist and doctor appointment I'd attended alone. About the night Ellie had a fever, and I rode it like a storm, lights off, whispering into the sweat at her hairline, while he slept in a hotel under a duvet turned down by someone else. I thought about love, real love, the kind that doesn't make you smaller to fit into a life someone is building without room for you to turn around in it. "Do you have a pen?" I asked him, because I needed a second to steady my voice. He lit up and handed me one like he'd anticipated applause. I didn't sign. I went to the bedroom, pulled the fireproof box from behind our sweaters, and brought it back to the island. I set it down like a brick between us. For a long second we just breathed. The baby cooed, the air conditioner hummed, and history shifted its weight. "I remember," I said quietly, "that you told me this was logistics." He stepped back. "What are you?" I opened the box and took out the prenup we'd both signed when we weren't yet exhausted versions of ourselves. I put it next to his list. It looked delicate compared to the thick stack he'd given me. Paper versus paper wasn't the duel it seemed. The words mattered. The words we chose back when we still believed in each other's better selves mattered. "You added that dignity paragraph to humor yourself," he said, trying to make it light. His face had changed. He knew the shape of what was coming before I said it. He always was good at reading the weather when it affected him. "We added it," I corrected. "You signed it. This?" I tapped his list. "This is not partnership. This meets the line we drew. This steps over it." He started talking fast, throwing pillows over his own fire. He said I was taking it out of context. He said a home needed structure. He said my anxiety made me reactive. He said he loved me. He said the words the way people say them in magic tricks, as if they alone can misdirect. I wasn't a magician. I was a mother. I was a woman who had asked herself quietly, in the grocery store parking lot and in the bathroom brushing my teeth, what I would want my daughter to do if someone put a list like this in her hands. The answer arrived simple and clean. I would want her to stand up. The thing about keeping a list is you begin to see patterns. The thing about loving someone smart is you learn to be explicit. The thing about becoming a mother is that your tolerance for disrespect shrinks to a point so small you can't see it anymore without a microscope. "I'm not signing this," I said, setting his rules down like a hot pan. "And I'm not living like someone you hire and manage. We either go to therapy and treat each other like people, or we talk to a different kind of professional." His laugh was soft and cruel at the same time. "You couldn't afford to leave," he said almost kindly. "You don't even have your own savings anymore." I looked at the papers in my hand, at the words we'd committed to on a good day, and felt the strange click of a puzzle piece sliding into place. "You were right," I told him. "It's logistics. We went to therapy. He went once and announced it wasn't for him. He brought home flowers like Band-Aids. He didn't take his rules off the fridge. He stopped asking for my signature, as if to prove his old point that they were just guidelines. He started keeping his own list, a mental one I could hear. How often I raised my voice, how tired I looked, how unfair it was that I didn't see the stress he carried. Stress like a trophy, stress like a badge. I kept breathing, I kept cooking, I kept marking things down, not like a prosecutor, but like a historian. When Ellie started to mimic the cadence of my apology, tiny hands raised, face earnest, I stopped apologizing for everything, a small rebellion that made the walls feel farther apart. It is a strange thing to prepare for battle while sitting on the floor with pastel blocks. The day I met with the lawyer my aunt had sent me to the first time, I brought Ellie's snack and a soft blanket and the prenup. I also brought the list of rules he'd given me and a folder I'd filled slowly with proof of all the little ways control had been introduced and normalized in our home. There were texts that read like directives. There were screenshots of calendars where he approved my plans as if I were an intern. There were gentle suggestions that turned into policy. I cried when I set the folder down and then laughed because I didn't want to be the stereotype. And then cried again because stereotypes exist for a reason. My lawyer had an orchid on her desk. It was different from the first one. This one had more blooms, a riot of white that looked like a standing ovation. She read in silence. When she looked up, she didn't perform anger on my behalf. She asked me if I was safe. She asked me what I wanted. She didn't push. "The paragraph we wrote," she said, slowly tapping the page like it was a pulse, "is unusual, but not unenforceable, particularly if there's documentation of patterns. Particularly given the language here about coercive behavior and shared decision-making, the part about commitments around care, the part about how agreements in this family are not to be made under pressure. It helps, Maya. Hearing my name said like that, soft, steady, made me feel like I'd been pried out of something sticky and set down carefully on solid ground. We drew up a plan. Not a list, not a set of rules, but a plan for leaving that looked like kindness wherever it was possible, and like boundaries wherever kindness failed. I found a small rental with windows that whispered. I packed in sections while he was away, which he always was. I told the truth to 3 people and let everyone else think what they would, because I had learned that secrets keep you sick. I took his list off the fridge and tucked it into my folder. I cried in the shower and in the car and not in front of my daughter. I learned the exact sound the front door made when I closed it quietly. The day I left, the sky was the kind of hard blue that Texas does better than anywhere else, like the whole dome of it had been scrubbed. I strapped Ellie into her car seat and gave her a strawberry, which she mashed in her fist with the concentration of a surgeon. I put the fireproof box in the trunk next to the bag of her favorite books. My hands didn't shake, my heart did. He called as the garage door rolled up. He always had a sixth sense for when control was slipping. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice a performative concern he could turn on like a faucet. "To a friend's," I said. I didn't explain. I didn't ask permission. I drove. In stories like these, there's always a dramatic reveal, a courtroom with echoes, a judge with a gavel, an audience. Real life is more papers and meetings, more sitting under fluorescent lighting resisting the urge to crack your knuckles. But there was a day that felt like a climax because it had the neatness of a scene. We were in a mediation room that smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. His lawyer had a smile that showed all her teeth and the eyes of someone who had never stayed up with a feverish baby and prayed over each breath. Carter had his expensive watch and a posture that said he wasn't worried. I had the necklace my mother had given me when I was 16 and a folder full of the ordinary ways my marriage had gotten smaller. I had the prenup, open to the paragraph everyone had laughed at for sounding sentimental. I had the list he had given me with my name typed at the bottom next to a blank line. They wanted to talk about money. I wanted to talk about Ellie. When I slid the list across the table, his lawyer tried to make a joke about expectations. When I slid the prenup after it, she stopped smiling. My lawyer didn't gloat. She simply pointed at the section that read like a prayer we'd written to our future selves, and then at the evidence that showed we'd stopped honoring it. There were messages about my clothes, about who I could see, about how often I was allowed to speak to my own family, about the budget that only he controlled, about the ring camera he'd installed inside and called a precaution. The silence that followed was exciting in the way a storm is when you're safe behind glass. He looked at me then like someone seeing the edge of a cliff for the first time. He tried to reframe. He said he was scared. He said he wanted structure because his childhood had been chaotic. He said therapy. He said sorry. He said a lot of things with his mouth that didn't undo the ink on the page. We walked out with a plan that favored me as Ellie's primary parent, which is the clinical way of saying I took my daughter home to a place that felt like air. It wasn't as simple as sliding a sheet across a table and saying checkmate, but it felt in that moment like I'd finally stopped playing a game I never agreed to. The mediator nodded at me like a woman who has seen enough to keep her expression small. Carter stood and reached for my hand as if we were still us. I didn't take it. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said in the hallway, quiet, almost like a secret. "I believe you," I said. "You wanted control. It hurts all the same." He looked suddenly young. "I don't know what to do without you telling me." There was a time that sentence would have sounded like love. It sounded now like an admission. If stories end there with a victorious fade to black, we miss the ache that follows. He asked for another chance in long messages that read like tall ships, elaborate and heavy. He came by with toys, with apologies, with a new therapist's number he said he'd call. He said he'd cut out the control like a tumor. He asked me to forgive him. Some days I almost did, in the way you almost step down a stair that isn't there. But then I'd watch Ellie in her crib, blowing spit bubbles and trying to catch her own toes. And I'd remember that what I'm modeling will be the story she tells herself about what love is. Forgiveness is not the same as reunion. I forgave him in pieces, the way you forgive weather for ruining a picnic. He began showing up on the days carved out for him, on time, sober, polite. He took parenting classes, the court recommended. He stopped telling me what to wear because my body was no longer in his jurisdiction. He started to see a version of himself I'd wished for, too late to live in my house, but just in time to be a father she could recognize. He asked for my forgiveness again one afternoon in a park where the wind turned my hair into a flag. His voice shook. He didn't blink when I told him forgiveness, for me, was not a key back into my life, but a door that swung shut without trapping either of us inside. The first night in the rental felt like a hotel, which is to say, it felt both temporary and glamorous. Ellie slept in the crib I assembled with my aunt, who brought pizza and the kind of humor that keeps you upright. We hung fairy lights because that's what fairy lights are for, a small rebellion against the dark. I sat on the floor and cried with my head in my hands, and then laughed because there was no one to perform for, and then I slept like I hadn't in years. In the mornings, light poured through the windows as if the house were being forgiven. I fed Ellie peaches so ripe they stained her chin, and we wore our messes like badges. I pulled out my art supplies and made a space at the dining table where we could both make things. Our papers spread out like wings. I took on a small group for an after-school art club and watched girls and boys lean over their work with their entire backs. That particular kind of intensity children bring when no one is telling them the right way to hold a brush. Friends returned. They brought coffee and floor time and gossip. They didn't ask me to explain myself over and over. They built new rituals with me. My sister came over with iced tea and a toolbox and tightened things that had been wobbling: chairs, shelves, me. My aunt sat on my porch and told me stories about women in our family who had left and women who had stayed, and she did not give either choice a crown. She just told the truth, and let the truth be the scaffolding I climbed. Carter kept coming around for Ellie, and sometimes we talked about logistics with a civility that felt like victory. He stopped wearing the watch he used to use as a weapon, glancing at it during conversations like I was stealing something from him by speaking. He asked once if I'd consider trying again. I said no as gently as I could, which is to say I said no without explaining all the reasons. No was the only answer that left me whole. He nodded. He looked like someone who had finally read the manual for a complicated machine and understood why it hadn't worked when he'd tried to force it. The list he'd made me, the one with rules about my voice and my clothes and how small I should become to fit into the life he thought we were building, ended up in a file in my closet. Not because I wanted to keep it as a trophy, but because I like to remember how close I came to accepting it. The prenup went back into the fireproof box, but this time it felt like a map I had followed out of the woods. People love a moral. They want the story to peel back and reveal a sentence you can stitch on a pillow. Here's mine. If someone hands you a list of rules that shrinks you, get bigger. If someone tries to love you with conditions written in a font you can't read without squinting, get glasses. Love is not a checklist. Respect is not a negotiation. Partnership doesn't require signatures to become valid. Sometimes revenge looks like leaving and living better. Sometimes justice is a quiet house with a child who falls asleep with paint on her fingers and a mother who cleans her own kitchen on her own terms. Sometimes the karmic balance you were waiting for is just you, choosing differently and watching the universe adjust its weight. Months later, a season that felt like an entire life, I ran into his sister at the farmer's market. We stood by a table heaped with tomatoes that looked like someone had smudged them with blush. She hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm proud of you." Carter had been doing better, she said. He seemed smaller, in a good way. He was learning to take up the amount of space his own body needed instead of pulling air from around him. He'd asked her for forgiveness. She'd given it. We both cried a little, the way women do standing in public with sunglasses pushed up as if they are shields. When I got home, Ellie was covered in flour. And so was the dog I'd finally adopted, who had learned that kitchens are places where love falls from countertops. We made biscuits that were messy and lopsided and perfect. We ate them on the floor. We didn't ask anyone for permission, and no one snapped their fingers for me to hurry. I got to decide the rhythm. I got to be wrong and right and loud and quiet. I got to be a person. Sometimes I still hear it, the snap, like a phantom sound in a room where it doesn't belong. Sometimes I flinch. Then I look at my daughter trying to stack cups into a tower she knocked down on purpose because destruction is part of creation. And I remember, I opened the box. I read the words. I chose a different story. I walked out with my head up and my child on my hip, and the universe did not collapse. It expanded. The sky made room. The air got sweeter. And when he asked later, standing on my porch with his hands empty and his eyes honest in a way I don't think they'd ever been, if there was any part of me that could forgive him, I told him the truth. I already had, the only way that mattered. I forgave him by not becoming what he'd tried to turn me into. I forgave him by teaching our daughter that her voice is not negotiable. I forgave him by living a life where lists are for groceries and dreams. not for shrinking a woman down to fit inside a man's fear. He nodded. He cried a little. He thanked me. He took his time walking back to his car, and when the door closed, it didn't sound like escape or defeat. It sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like closure. The lights in my home come on with switches I flip with my own hand. The budget lives in an envelope with scribbles and plans and messy calculations done in pencil because I've made room for mistakes. My laughter is loud. My clothes are mine. My rules are simple. Be kind, be brave, be honest. And when Ellie grows, and someone someday tries to hand her a list with lines about how small she has to be to belong, I hope she remembers her mother in a kitchen with flour on her elbows and a smile that didn't ask permission. And I hope she knows what to do. She opened the box. She read the words. She walked away towards a life that fits.
Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts about the story in the comments. See you in the next one.